So, Steve, we're looking at the image from New York on the East River, and this is the first image that we captured. Tell me about it.
Well, this is a perfect example of how I like to create space and dimension in a photograph. As it happens, this is a 240 millimeter lens. You know, in a perfect world, I would like a 230 millimeter lens, but I don't have that. So you can see the tight framing on either building. I would like a touch more space, but that certainly would not cause me to not use this image. There's just too much positive things that are happening in this particular composition. Now, what I say about creating a sense of space and depth, you'll see in an image later on that I took more as a reference point, but I have heard in the past that people have critiqued images that are on the internet where the photographer chose a vantage point where the actual island of Manhattan looks as though it's sitting right on top of the pilings.
Yep, I've seen that many times.
Which, yeah, it's kind of interesting and whatnot, but I have seen the images, and the first thing that comes to my mind is there's no sense of depth or dimension there. So when you see that little half-inch strip of water between the top of the pilings and the actual landmass of Manhattan, that to me, for my way of constructing photographs, is the single most important component of this photograph. You have an interesting foreground, you have an interesting near-far relationship with the city in the background, but without that strip of water in the middle, you would lose all sense of any kind of dimension. So that to me is the single most important factor in the photograph. Now, when you get the serenity of the water being still and somewhat silky, that adds some interest. The light on the buildings, that adds some interest. The actual different shapes of the buildings adds interest. But again, nothing in my mind is more powerful than the near-far relationship, and that is reinforced by that particular strip of water in the center.
I agree. You can definitely see there's certainly a lot of distance between from where the photographer viewer is compared to where the skyline actually begins. You know, there's a lot of subtleties going on in this image. You know, you still were able to balance the window light in the buildings with the early morning sunrise, and even with the image, the building on the far right with the little veins going through it. It's like there's a lot of dancing and motion going on. So talk about that for a minute.
Well, again, you know, that building, when you see it at night, you really don't get the sense of those irregular shapes on the actual facade of that building. But when you begin to get the light that's coming up, still well below the horizon, but nevertheless you have a huge flat of brighter sky over there, it does begin to cast a higher intensity light on that particular building. And this is what's different between film and the eye-brain relationship. The eye-brain relationship, it's so dark, it really doesn't process those differences, especially when it has to take in all the other expanse of what's in front of you. But the film, on the other hand, it sees everything in a literal sense, and the film has nowhere near the capability of recording contrast that you and I do. Mm-hmm. So therefore, little subtle things like that begin to show themselves even though the human eye is yet to really perceive them, which is kind of the exact opposite of what happens when when you get into a situation that's very contrasty. So again, the camera didn't move. Our day began about 2 o'clock in the morning, where we drove down here, and this is the image that I had wanted to capture for the lighting and composition video. So again, I haven't the video or the composition was constructed such that there'd be that strip of water, and the two buildings would frame where I knew the light was going to be, somewhere around on the thirds. And at the moment in time that it happened, the shutter was clicked. Now, some of the things that went into the pre-planning of this, I was metering the scene, and as the scene would get brighter and brighter, so would the sky. So as it happened, those two buildings that are brightest in the center of the image, those tonalities measured essentially the exact same value that the sky did. That would not have been very interesting at all. So because the buildings were more of a light and white color, I chose to try to darken what was becoming a blue sky, and I chose an orange filter, which essentially moved the blue component of the whole composition down the scale because because orange is opposite of blue. So it added just enough of a sense of difference in tonality to again create a more sense of the buildings projecting themselves because they are brighter. And then of course you have the most powerful part of the scene of the sunburst, creating that burst that's reflecting off of a shaped building that is actually round at that particular point, and it creates that big hot spot in the water. And it's a very interesting component of a photograph that I had made years ago at night.
That's the image that we saw at the very beginning of this lighting composition.
Correct. Yes, it
which is that was nice. Because I'm looking at this one, even with the starburst. I mean, you've got this reflection on the river, and it just, again, it's from the center point down to the bottom of the frame. It just keeps drawing you in to look at that starburst, and there's so much movement going on. And again, that building on the far right with those little veins. I mean, again, it's like they're dancing. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Exactly, and those little things that you just point out, those to me are areas of interest. They're not the central focal point, but they're areas that keep your eye just continually going through this photograph and picking out little other areas of interest. And this is what a really well-constructed composition and understanding of how to expose film under different lighting conditions really pays dividends, where you get all these little pockets of added interest. While the framing or the bookends of those two buildings kind of dictated my vantage point, that doesn't mean that I didn't move side to side to try to put the pilings in a more photographic and a more dimensional sense of space.
There's a lot going on here. Again, there's that subtle balance. I know this is lighting and composition, but the lighting itself, I mean, you've balanced sunlight, basically full-blown sun, and you're still able to capture and keep and reproduce window light, basically the lights inside the building, and you've captured that information on the piece of film. That you haven't lost that. I mean, that is very powerful when you actually look at it and you actually see all these little specular highlights of information that keep drawing you in, and you keep looking. I enjoy looking at this.
Well, I mean, this particular end of the discussion is more targeted at negative design and exposure, but it nevertheless, when you expose a piece of film and develop it like I do, you have many more options than you would if you ordinarily expose it as traditional wisdom would tell you from 20 years ago, when graded papers were all that were available. So I have a lot of flexibility because of my negative design. Negatives that I exposed 15 and 20 years ago, I do not have the same flexibility, even though I'm a better printer now than I was back then. It's purely a function of negative design and development and how it relates to multi-contrast papers. And we're going to learn about that in future components of my process.
Nice. Looking forward to it, Steve. Steve, this is beautiful. I really enjoyed being there with you and videotaping that. That was an incredibly fun day, and I'm looking forward to doing that again.
It was a fun day, Peter. We got a lot accomplished.